A big vote expected today at the FCC that would block Huawei and ZTE from receiving federal money to help build broadband infrastructure. Now, the two companies could be named as national security threats, which would then block them from receiving anything from the $8.5 billion universal service fund that the government offers to sell companies. Here to discuss this vote, national security, China, and so much more. Ash Carter is joining us, former U.S. Defense Secretary and now director of Harvard's Belfer Center. He's the author of Inside the Five-Sided Box. Secretary Carter will be participating in the digital currency national security crisis simulation at Harvard later today with Larry Summers, Nick Burns, and others. I kind of want to be a fly on the wall for that, Ash. But let's start with Huawei. Is there a compromise? Is there somewhere that could be met in the middle so that Huawei could still operate, at least in some parts of the world, without compromising our own national security?
Well, what you see going on here, Andrew, is exactly as you indicate, a mix of national security policy and economic policy going on. That's new for us. It's not new for China. We're looking for a playbook for a communist China that we both trade with and compete with militarily. And we didn't have that. We have the Cold War playbook, which is all military, no economics. And we have the free trade playbook for countries like France and so forth, which is all economics and not military competition. And we're getting a mix here. Now, Huawei is such a serious case of potential national security consequence that both in the FCC rulings and in the trade talks, you see our government taking the point of view that it's a national security problem to have all their stuff installed in our country and in our allies' countries. That's not going to change. We may make some particular and temporary carve-outs for a while, and that's what's probably going to happen.
But from your perspective, if you were in office right now, would you? I mean, the argument or the issue here is that people. It does appear that Huawei is being used to some degree as a pawn in the larger trade war. And so either you believe it is a genuine national security threat or it isn't, right? I mean, it's sort of hard for it to be both.
Well, you're right. And that would say, well, how can you trade national security for soybeans? And how can you, in other words, how can you mix an issue like the Huawei issue as a national security issue up in the trade talks? And you're absolutely right. There's a limit to the extent to which we can do that. At the same time, we are trying to connect our security policy and our economic policy, because remember, that's what the Chinese do so well. So when we have an economic issue with the Chinese, we want to be able to also bring in the national security side. And when we have a national security issue with the Chinese, we want to bring in the economic side. That's the kind of new playbook that we're trying to develop here. And it is new, and you have to be careful that you don't sell your security, because our security can't be for sale and isn't for sale. But at the margins, we can make those kind of.
But that's the part of this I don't understand. I mean, I've read thoroughly, the DoD innovation report, which effectively said allowing Huawei not just entree to the United States, but entree to any part of the West, any part of the world, actually becomes a security threat for us, because ultimately we are going to need access to those lines, those communication lines, and by default we'll be using their services, and that becomes a problem unto itself.
That's right. And that is a problem, and I don't think that can be appropriately traded away in trade talks or for anything else economically. Huawei is a serious case. It goes to the heart of what is going to be a two-internet world, a two-tech
So you think there's a decoupling that's about to happen here? When you just talked about a two-internet world.
It's already happening.
They're talking about it as the
it's already happening. It's already happening. Remember, the Chinese have been running a separate internet for some years. This isn't a choice for the United States, whether there are going to be two technological systems around the internet. The Chinese have made that choice. It's going to be that way. And there'll be some things that we share, but very substantially they'll be different. Yeah.
Do you think that over the last 30 or 40 years that our policy of engagement, which arguably was in the interest of trying to open up China, has ultimately failed?
Yes, in the sense that we tried and they decided to go a different direction. China did not turn out the way that many people hoped in the 1990s. Now, I was one of those people who came to the conclusion about 20 years ago that it was not going to be what we hoped, which is end up a big France, a nice trading partner with which we got along in other ways. But by now, I think there's a broad consensus, and this is deepened just in the last few years in the United States, that China is not going to come our way. It's going to go its way, and we're going to have a very serious protracted competitive situation with what is, after all, communist dictatorship. And that's why the Huawei issue is not going to be, I don't think, resolved in the course of the trade talks.
David,
I think that's too strong.
You're an old China hand here. This is.
I would say, I would question whether anyone could say that China hasn't dramatically changed, I think, even for the positive in the last 30 years. I think it's more open than 30 years ago. It's much more progressive than it was 30 years ago. And yes, maybe it hasn't gone as far as what we would like it to go. I would never say never about the future.
Well, let me just talk about the present. I'm sorry, I can't agree with that.
That's okay.
It is a communist dictatorship that has settled upon a view that it is not going to just fit into the world as in other countries, especially the United States, have created a world of values of freedom and also free trade, that it's going to go the Chinese way. That is what many people hoped, and it was reasonable to hope.
Ash, but isn't that Xi Jinping 2013 and forward?
What I'm saying, yes, absolutely.
Right.
And I knew Jiang Zemin, I knew Hu Jintao, I knew Xi Jinping. And you can see right there in that progression,
right.
With Jiang Zemin, you could have a conversation in which it was plausible that he may end up now, by this time in 2019, in a situation where China wasn't trying to carve out a separate kind of world centered on China, but a world in which it fit in and, of course, had a big role, naturally enough, but it wasn't a China-centric international system. By the time you get to Xi Jinping, I mean, read what he says. He has announced that they're going to be that China's going to have its own independent tech base, including internet, that it is the Chinese time to shine on the world, not to shine with the rest of the world, but to make up for 100 years of humiliation and so forth. That's a very different attitude from the one that Jiang Zemin had, and China is going to follow Xi Jinping's path. Now, that doesn't mean I think there's going to be a war or even a Cold War in the sense of a replay of what we have in the Soviet Union. But you got to look for China, to look at China for what it is, a communist dictatorship that has determined that it wants to be at the center of Asia and possibly ultimately the center of the world. They say that, and that they're going to be independent in areas of sensitive technology from the rest of the world, and especially the United States. So these aren't choices that Americans have anymore. These are choices that China has made, and we have to play the game that's on the field.
Secretary Carter, always great to hear from you and your perspective. It's a debate that is not going anywhere, and I imagine we will continue to have it with you, and we hope to speak with you soon. And I'm looking forward to what you're doing later today. So thanks so very much for coming on.
Thanks very much.
You bet.
Good to be with you, as always.